Greetings, Gov students. Today we are going to be looking at the powers and duties of the President of the United States. Presidents like Jefferson here have built-in constitutional powers, but there are also, over the course of history, other powers that have become the realm of the Oval Office. And so we're going to take a look at those major duties and powers, and hopefully, post-lecture, you can take that information and use it to illustrate your understanding. Here we go. Presidential duties and powers. The first duty or power, head of state. Do you guys know how the Queen in England tends to walk around a lot, waving? People want to get as close as they can. It's super exciting. She goes to dinners, she goes to funerals. She represents Britain as a person, not so much a political power. We don't have a queen, darn. Our president does that role along with all of his others. Our head of state, he will go to classrooms and read books to students. He will shake hands with visitors to the White House. Anytime a foreign dignitary comes here, it's often a dinner at the White House. He'll travel periodically to participate in various things too, as the head of our country. Now, this isn't exactly spelled out in the Constitution, but it's one of those, hello, of course, kind of jobs that a president has to do. Throwing out the first baseball began with a big baseball fan, and I mean big, 360 pounds big. President Taft, huge baseball fan. Now, some presidents opt out. For example, President Trump has not yet, in his 3 years, participated in throwing out the first baseball. But you can see here presidents that have. I'm looking at Clinton, Reagan, Obama. We've got Kennedy in the middle top. We got Nixon on the right upper corner. You got Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman on the far right middle. You got Taft himself, folks, right there, dead center, bottom middle. And then Mr. President Ford off to the right there. Just one of those tasks. Now, if you look at a president's daily schedule, you'll see head of state stuff built into it. Most schedules are spelled out by the minute for a president. And some of those are quick photo ops that will happen in the Oval Office or somewhere nearby. Here you see President Bush awarding some medal to a Boy Scout and others standing around there. Great example of the president's role as head of state. Second, chief executive. This one is very constitutional. The president heads the executive branch, which today involves a massive bureaucracy of agencies and departments and corporations, all working under the umbrella of the presidency, the White House, the executive branch. So I would call the White House itself kind of the brain trust. They're at the very top of the executive branch, and from there it goes down sort of in a pyramid structure. The cabinet, of course, are the top aides, secretaries of the major departments that help the president with his task.
Great Wall was very cool.
I was going to say that.
One of the things I'm most proud of is the cabinet we've assembled. I mean, you've got extraordinarily talented people in each of these fields. A lot of them are doing such a good job that they don't meet with me much because they're like the good students in class. They are just handling their business really well.
Well, hello everybody. It is good to see you guys.
We try to do a cabinet meeting every 2 months. The meetings run about an hour and a half. What we'll do is talk to a lot of different folks within the White House, the policy folks, the Chief of Staff's office, the communications office, and find out what are the important initiatives that we want to talk to the cabinet about, and also talk to the cabinet as well about the issues that they think are important to discuss with the president. So there's a series of internal meetings to discuss that, and we hammer out an agenda after that.
Iraq, Afghanistan, the Asia trip, jobs. I think that there should probably be robust discussion of job creation.
here. This is a huge kind of 6-7 weeks that's coming up, and a lot of the budget and obviously the war decision and a bunch of other things that are coming down the pike. So
each president has the discretion to decide who's in this cabinet. There are the heads of the 15 executive departments who are always in the cabinet. These are the people who are in the line of succession after the president and vice president. And then there are a number of folks who have cabinet rank. In our administration, that would be the head of OMB, EPA, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the ambassador to the United Nations.
Some cabinet members meet more frequently than others with the president. And then there are White House office personnel, too, that are around the president every day. Now, some of the powers that come from this role as chief executive, I've got there listed. And you might want to put these off to the side because they may help you later with our assessment. But pardoning, amnesty, reprieves, those are all related to giving somebody a quote-unquote get-out-of-jail-free card. Now, the pardon, clear and free. You can be pulled out of prison, pulled out of a court situation, kept from being charged with something, with a pardon by the president. Now, governors carry that same power. It's usually called clemency. When Governor Whitmer here in Michigan would have the power to grant clemency to state prisoners. President has this power at the federal level. Now, amnesty, generally I would call that like a group pardon, like when Jimmy Carter granted amnesty to all those who dodged the draft. And then reprieves are like a temporary pardon. Hold on, don't execute that guy yet because there's some quirky things about this case that we should look at first. And so you grant a reprieve, which might be 6 months, it might be a year, not a full pardon. Now, what other powers come from being chief executive? The executive orders. We've seen President Trump use this many times. It's not really law, but it's kind of like law because it affects oftentimes the entire country, even though as an executive order, it's really a directive that's going out to your executive branch, some department or agencies involved that you want them to do something maybe differently than they were doing it before. An executive order. Executive privilege also falls here. Your right to keep certain communications confidential because it affects your inner workings at the White House with your confidants. And so there's some legal protection that comes with the executive privilege. And that, I think, sums up our role as chief executive. Oh, by the way, when you come into office, this screen here just illustrates that there are a lot of positions that need to be filled, and that too, that's probably your first job as chief executive, is to pick the people who are going to be working around you. And that can be time consuming because most of them have to go through a background check. And then for the major executive positions, like the cabinet department officials and so on, they have to be approved by the Senate. And there you go. Now, third role, chief legislator. As chief legislator, the president, despite not being part of the legislature, the president does carry legislative power. The most obvious one being the veto. We'll get to that in a minute. But what a lot of people don't know is that the president is really the starting point of the national or federal budget. The president, along with help from the Office of Management and Budget, and others, essentially produce the next year's budget, which in this country is massive. And that will go to Congress, and Congress will play with it, and then back to the White House. And there's back and forth, but eventually that budget gets passed in several different huge, what we call appropriations bills. Another one is the State of the Union address, which is given every year, essentially telling Congress, hey, Congress, this is what I'd like to accomplish. These are some goals that I think we'd like to achieve together. And the State of the Union address is that way to kind of set an agenda for the government to tackle. The veto. If Congress passes a bill that lands on the president's desk, the president does have the power to veto that bill. It is an act. You have to actively veto, and then you have to give that bill back to Congress. Congress has the power to override that veto with a 2/3 vote in both the House and then a 2/3 vote in the Senate. So both House and Senate have to get that 2/3 vote, which is not easy, especially in today's polarized political world. Line item veto, that's a side note. Let's not worry about it. But for a while, the president was allowed to just get rid of certain addendums, add-ons to a bill that they thought were wasteful spending or political or whatever reason. But they could veto these add-ons without vetoing the gist of the bill, the important part of the bill. But that is no longer constitutional. Now, as chief legislator, some things to keep in mind. If you're president, it does help to get cushy, to develop relationships with Congress, because you want to accomplish goals. You have an agenda coming into the White House, and you want to get those things done. No better way to do that than to schmooze with congresspersons, because they are very powerful and they can make your life miserable if you don't. Now, problems. It's especially difficult when the Congress is controlled by the other party, but also just ignoring a certain congressional leader can get you in trouble, because they have power to lead their forces, whether that's the Democrats or Republicans, and they can make it impossible for you to get your legislation passed.
This legislation provides for direct payments to individuals and unprecedented support to small businesses. We're going to keep our small businesses strong and our big businesses strong, and that's keeping our country strong and our jobs strong. All right, thank you all. Good, I wanted that to be a nice signature.
All right. Chief diplomat, power and duty number 4. This also is a constitutional power. The president has far more control over foreign policy than Congress, because the president can move around. They can take Air Force One and visit anybody, anytime. And so hanging out with other world leaders, cracking deals with other world leaders, that is part of being president. Very significant role. Wow. All right. So what about chief diplomat? Well, first of all, you want to appoint people around you that are going to help you with this role. And you have to pick a Secretary of State. The State Department is essentially our foreign policy department. You have to pick ambassadors appointed and then sent throughout the world in these massive houses/buildings where our U.S. government is represented abroad. Every country that we recognize has an embassy within it, and in that embassy, that's the residence of our ambassadors. Now, there are a few countries, like North Korea, for example, that do not have a U.S. embassy or a U.S. ambassador, because we do not recognize them as a country. We're kind of enemies at the moment. That can happen. Other helpful advisors, the National Security Council, and then finally, the intelligence part. Every morning, a briefing lands on the president's desk, sent to him by a combination of intelligence agencies that are finding out what's going on throughout the world. The National Security Agency is an important one. Central Intelligence Agency is another. Now, finally, what are some of the key powers related to being the chief diplomat? One of them is the treaty. The treaty is the power of a president to crack a deal with a country, but then because that's an agreement specifically between one country's people and another, that treaty does have to go through the Senate and get approved by the United States Senate. Now, an executive agreement does not have to go to the Senate. That's a deal between two leaders. So maybe it's President Trump and Vladimir Putin of Russia that crack a little nuclear arms agreement. While nobody has any say there because it's just between those two leaders, it does affect things, maybe brings about a safer world or something like that. However, Congress has no say. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is a treaty has more long-term lasting impact because it's between two peoples. Somebody would have to violate the treaty to make it essentially dissipate. With an executive agreement, the next president in office or the next leader in, say, Russia or China or whoever you're dealing with, that next leader would not have to abide by that executive agreement that was cracked between you and the other leader you cracked it with. So there is a difference between the two. Obviously, presidents like an executive agreement because they don't have to deal with the politics of the Senate. But at the same time, that treaty is it's a larger, bigger impact deal. Commander-in-Chief. And the president is the top military decision maker. We call commander-in-chief, directly stated in the Constitution. And every president to this point has had to play some role, our modern presidents, as commander-in-chief, whether that meant a quick strike offense against some terrorist movement or some government that was being hard to deal with maybe U.S. forces abroad, or it's just outright war. I mean, can you imagine being President Truman and having to make that decision to drop a nuclear weapon? Wow, that is a tough decision and a lonely decision at the top. Commander-in-Chief. Now, there is a limit put in place as of 1973 called the War Powers Act. The Vietnam War, guys, was never really a war because Congress never declared war. It was a military action that just kind of continued and escalated, and Congress sort of gave the president the power to escalate this thing into a war without a declaration. So the War Powers Act was intended to prevent another Vietnam scenario. And so the deal is, let's say President Trump decides to blow up a terrorist leader. And this blow-up occurs in another country with U.S. Drones and troops obviously running the drone. Congress is supposed to be notified of that event within 48 hours. If this event escalates into further action, like all of a sudden we have ground forces that are doing battle with Iranian military personnel in the middle of Iraq/Iran, somewhere in there, yikes. Congress has to be kind of called into play here. You have 60 days to get congressional approval to continue any military action. If the Congress refuses to comply, to give you that ability, presidents by the War Powers Act have to bring those troops home. Now, most of our presidents are not military experts, and so you do have a lot of people helping. I've got some images here of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but the Pentagon has all of military personnel, the top people there that are helping the president make decisions. And then you have a Secretary of State, because you do have to have diplomacy and negotiation mixed in there. All right, economic planner. The president, despite the fact that economics are impossible to really control, presidents worry about it because if the economy's tanking while you're running for re-election, you usually don't win because people tie good economies to presidents and bad economies to presidents. And we've seen that effect time and again. Elections, second-term elections, is where that really comes through. Just ask George Herbert Walker Bush, who had just won a war in easy fashion, the Persian Gulf War, and then the recession hits and things are tanking. And despite the fact that that war victory, which left him with like 75% approval rating, had only been about a year prior, and yet he still lost the election because people were feeling the pain of that recession. Ouch. Now, can presidents control economies? No, but they can certainly help us get through them. And they certainly do everything they can to avoid downturns by trying to, quote unquote, spark the economy. And that's why they're constantly monitoring it like they do. There is a lot of help there. We have a Council of Economic Advisors in the White House office. There's the Office of Management and Budget. There's the Department of Treasury. There's the Department of Commerce. And then, of course, you have the Federal Reserve, which is the one managing our currency. And the Federal Reserve, I would argue, is probably the most powerful independent agency when it comes to our economy, because their ability to control the flow of currency, to set interest rates and so on, has such a huge impact on the economy. But that's also one of the reasons they're independent. If we allowed presidents who know nothing about economics, really, none of them, maybe Hoover, he didn't do that well, but our presidents don't know economics. And so these people have to be left alone, because the last thing you want is a bunch of goofballs running our currency system into the ground, because it can happen. Remember World War II, Germany, wheelbarrows full of cash to buy loaves of bread? Yeah, you don't want that. And so those folks are expected to try to maintain control over the value of our money. Party leader. Some love it, some don't. Now, Trump's been doing essentially party rallies the whole time he's been in office, which is really unusual. You usually start doing those as you get near to an election. But as the top Republican right now, President Trump has a role to kind of get out there for the troops. You want other Republicans to win office. So in 2018, Trump made himself available to fellow Republicans who wanted him at rallies to help them win office. And that's part of your job as party leader. You're the top dog of your party.
We cannot afford, this country, the future of this country, cannot afford to lose a seat in the very, very close United States Senate. We can't afford it, folks. We can't. We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. Can't do it.
Now, there's a quirky term we call patronage, and that kind of relates to this as well. Sometimes you pay people back, quote unquote, pay people back for being loyal to you, for being loyal to the party, and that can sometimes mean you get government positions in a new administration, and that's what we call patronage. And I use the example of Linda McMahon, who I'm not sure she is anymore, but she started out as President Trump's head of the Small Business Administration. And of course, this was a relationship that went back years. He is very close to the McMahon family, and that was one of the reasons Linda was chosen as his administrator of the Small Business Administration. All right, voice of the people. Communication skills help immensely, but this is when you have to address the American people in a crisis. You guys have seen it the last couple of weeks. President Trump almost daily is giving an address to the American people about the coronavirus. And you get those times, it's often crisis, where the people need to hear from their leader. And that's where your ability to speak can become so crucial.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
How you manage a speech like that can impact how the public feels about you. And the higher your ratings are with the public, the more powerful you are when dealing with Congress and trying to get your agenda through. You want the people's support. And so these speeches give you the opportunity to really connect. And there's a variety of reasons for giving them. And sometimes it's not a crisis. Sometimes you're just seeking position for something, like we saw with Obama during the early stages of his presidency, trying to get Obamacare through. Very difficult bill to move through Congress, controversial. And so he goes to the people, and he's trying to convince people, hey, this is a great thing for you. Put pressure on your congressperson to support it. 9, protector of the peace. Bad stuff happens. Whether it's coronavirus, whether it's race riots, whether it's a hurricane, a massive fire. The president sometimes declares an area a disaster area, and that opens the door to federal funding and help.
Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, we just had a chance to tour some of the areas that were devastated by last week's tornadoes, and had a chance to meet with some of the families who lost loved ones. Also had a chance to thank some of the first responders and the recovery workers and members of the National Guard who have been working nonstop to help families and businesses pick up the pieces after this devastating tornado. I want to express my deep appreciation for Governor Beebe and his outstanding leadership, Senator Pryor, Congressman Griffin, Mayor Firestone. They all showed great leadership, and we're here on the ground throughout these difficult days.
FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, those are the workforce that can show up and help at the scene of any disaster. They distribute the funds, the food, water. Even the military can be used in a situation to protect the peace at home. Even forest fires, folks. I've heard of the National Guard being called into action, given shovels to dig huge trenches to try to stop a forest fire from continuing its journey through massive acreage of trees. And sometimes you just need sheer manpower to get that job done. And the president is the only one that really has the ability to say, hey, let's take 5,000 National Guard, get them out to Idaho to fight that fire. Finally, leader of the Western world. Now, this one is similar to diplomacy, but not, because with diplomacy, it's usually we're getting something, China's getting something. It's a deal between two countries. We're both getting something. With leader of the Western world, we're not always getting something, except maybe a more stable and peaceful world. But sometimes we jump into scenarios that maybe we don't necessarily belong in, but we're doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. We're doing it to try to keep peace. But we got some great examples here on the slide. Carter cracked an amazing historical peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Reagan and Gorbachev signed key legislation to cut nuclear arms. We've had peacekeepers, troops all over the world, sometimes with the UN, sometimes not, just trying to maintain stability in areas that are highly restless on the edge of civil war. Of course, the United Nations is a place where we have a very big voice when it comes to world issues. And sometimes, folks, it simply boils down to there's a country with a famine. There's a country with a massive humanitarian crisis, and we help. We give them our food. We give them our money. Sometimes troops, whatever we can do to help solve the problem, we're there for this humanitarian effort. And those can be great moments. But that's leader of the Western world. Now, one of the things we'll be doing in just a second is using these notes to go through scenarios like this. I want to run through these with you. Just to kind of do some 4 examples, all right? So here we go. LBJ sends troops to Detroit to stop rioting that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Jeopardy? Anybody? That would be protector of the peace at home, right? Clinton vetoes the partial birth abortion bill passed by, I don't even have to read anymore. He's vetoing a bill. That's chief legislator. Boom. President Bush attends a luncheon and rally in North Carolina. Boom. Again. This is party leader, man. Some guy, fellow Republican from North Carolina, is trying to win a seat. Bush is down there helping him out. Party leader. President Reagan meets with CEA to discuss a job program. The CEA is the Council of Economic Advisors, being developed by the Department of Labor to combat rising unemployment. Oh boy. This could be a couple. I see a lot of econ in there, so maybe economic planner. But this is also the president working with agencies, departments underneath him. So you could argue chief executive, right? 2 answers for number 4, huh? Sweet. 5, President Clinton addresses the country following the bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. In an emotionally charged speech, he mourns the loss and ensures justice. Voice of the people, baby, right? There you have it, students. Boy, I would argue that might be one of the most informative lectures I have ever been a part of. Jefferson, would you agree? Amen, brother. We'll catch you guys next time. Now, you're going to take these notes and go to Moodle. You'll find a, let's call it a link, that'll take you to a little exercise to practice use of this crucial presidential information. We'll catch you next time.